were brought over into slavery, which wasn't right, but they got the gospel when they got here. And you know what? I bet you there's a lot of Africans that if they hadn't have been brought over, not saying it was right, don't misunderstand, not justifying the slavery in the situation, but God, I still believe, used it. And now I'm sure there's a lot of Africans that got the gospel, and they're in heaven right now because they got the gospel. You know, what would be better? For them to have lived their entire life in Africa free, doing their voodoo or whatever, and then dying and going to hell, right? Or what happened? And then they go to heaven. They get the opportunity. Now again, it doesn't justify it. The ends do not justify the means, but this is how God works. This is what God does in the Bible. And we have black people in here. I don't think any of you guys were ever slaves. I was never a slave. It's like, white privilege. You were never a slave. You were never living during the time, unless you're very old, like 60 or 70 maybe, or 80 years old, you're never even living during a time where segregation was a thing in this country. I mean, what are you crying about? Nothing even happened to you. You're just making up stuff. You can't look at the facts that I was reading and just attribute that to some kind of white privilege. It's not real. Get over it. Quit having all the excuses. Why don't you take some responsibility for your choices? Be content with whatever situation you were born into and make the most of it. God's not limited to your situation. He can do above, what we ask or think.
Wagwan me family, welcome back to my YouTube commentary. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now, the video we have just watched, it's heavy. It's very, very heavy. Why? Because that one, he is a pastor and he's standing in front of his congregation trying to defend slavery, trying to justify slavery in a way that people in the church or the congregation in the church will take slavery lightly, will take the stakes or will take the atrocities that happen to black people lightly, like it was like a God will. You see that? We have all listened to that video. Okay? Stating that slavery was evil somehow, but it was used by God to bring Africans to Christianity. What does that mean? That means that he is trying to erase African spirituality and African civilization. Okay? Africa had his own faith systems and it was working. It had his own moral codes and it was working. Complex scientists long before colonizers arrived. So this sermon is trying to justify, is trying to weaponize Christianity. For him saying that God allowed slavery for salvation is dangerous logic, okay? And by that reasoning, any atrocity could be excused as part of God's plan. And it shifts blame away from the oppressors and put it on some mysterious being. That's what I'm going to talk today. But before I go down deep into my videos, into my commentary, I want you to watch these other clips of white pastors trying to justify slavery in a way that I think it is too dangerous. And this mindset is what we are trying not to raise our African kids, our black kids with it. Because when we raise our kids with that, they will grow up believing that it was bad. Let's watch these clips and then we come back.
Several folks sent me this video of Pastor Nathan Rager defending American slavery from the pulpit and saying it wasn't so bad.
American slavery, because it was in a Christian nation, torture and sexual abuse was universally condemned. Whenever it happened, it was rare and it was private affairs.
Tell me you're a racist pastor without telling me you're a racist pastor. Other humans were bartered for, traded, and sold because they were considered property, not people. The government even passed a law in 1787 stating that slaves were only 3/5 of a real person. Also, based on any credible historical account, inhumane torture and abuse was the rule, not the exception. Sexual abuse was rampant, common, and accepted. Then again, why would I ever expect fundamentalist culture to take responsibility for the sexual abuse during the Civil War when they're still actively covering up sexual abuse today?
I'm not delusional here.
Oh yeah, you are. This is disgusting, this is heresy, and slavery deserves our repentance, not our asinine excuses.
Snowflake social justice warrior idiots are racist against white people, okay? That's just the dumbest thing I ever heard, and it doesn't stand up to history. We know Robert E. Lee was a great fundamentalist Christian. By the way, he freed his slaves a couple years before the Civil War.
50 years ago, or 200 years ago, when the blacks were slaves, did they ever go to Washington, D.C. and have a rally 200 years ago to protest against slavery? Did they? No. What did they do? Well, a lot of good people in the plantations would say, hey, it's wintertime. Let us help build a church for you, dear folks. And they loved them and taught them how to read so they can read the Bible. And here's what the blacks did about 150 years ago. They humbled themselves. They prayed. They sought God's face and they turned from their wicked ways. And God made slavery illegal through several white presidents, right?
How does one group of people subjugate another? No, I'm just educating the girl. You subjugate a people by telling them their science is superstition, their faith is heresy, and their wisdom is make-believe. They called the American Indians savages. They called us, well, what didn't they call us?
I got it, okay?
No, you don't get it. From the moment you are born, you are so thoroughly indoctrinated by the insanity of Western European worldviews, you can't bear to see yourself the way nature would have. And you scoff at us and our superstitions. Well, those superstitions are in fact tributaries leading to rivers and oceans of truth about what you really are and who you might have been.
So let us talk about women voting, shall we?
Yeah, let's.
Back in the bad old days, before the 19th Amendment, the men were considered to be the heads of their households and represented their families at the ballot box.
Yeah, and before the 15th Amendment, slave owners represented their plantations at the ballot box. Things used to be different.
So what happened when their wives were granted suffrage?
Whoa. Wives were not granted suffrage. Women, single women, married women, divorced women, were granted suffrage. You've already set this up in a false scenario because it was not just married women who got the right to vote.
If both the husband and wife vote for Harding, say, then what you have done is simply multiply the number of total votes cast for him by 2. And if the husband votes for Harding, say, and the wife votes for Cox, then what you've done is cancel out the voice of that particular household.
All right, you've described 2 possible households, but guess what? There's way more than 2 types of households. You have households with adult children who still live at home. You have single guys. You have single women. You have a bunch of guys living together. You have a bunch of women living together. Before the 19th Amendment, there were households who had a single mother or a widowed mother who did not have any voice whatsoever. When you only consider 2 possible scenarios, you're committing the either-or fallacy. And you should know that's a fallacy, because it says so on page 230 of the logic textbook that you co-authored. Doug Wilson thinks that slavery was beneficial for the slaves. In his book, Southern Slavery as It Was, Doug Wilson says that slavery was not an adversarial relationship, but one based on mutual affection and confidence, and that had mutual intimacy and harmony. He said slave life was for the slaves a life of plenty, simple pleasures, food, clothes, and good medical care. And he says we can't overlook the benefits of slavery for both blacks and whites. But don't worry, he admits there were many horrific abuses in slavery, although he also says there are many situations characterized by benevolent masters. There's no such thing as a benevolent master. There are terrible masters, and there are less bad masters. But if you were truly benevolent, you would free your slaves. You would be a benevolent ex-master.
Why do Africans still worship foreign gods? The bigger question, why are Africans still dominated by foreign gods and religions? Christianity and Islam were used to justify colonialism, keeping Africans in a submissive mentality long after colonialism ended. Many of these faiths reject modern medicine, instead clinging to faith healing, just worsening things like AIDS and HIV. Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget that the Catholic Church condemned the use of condoms, which led to the spreading of AIDS and HIV on a scale never seen before. And lastly, Africans are taught to pray for solutions instead of actively working towards this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a trap. This is a way of controlling a person. What is the best way of keeping a prisoner imprisoned? Is to have the prisoner believe he is not a prisoner.
It is a little strange that we have such an aversion to slavery because historically there have been abuses There have been abuses in marriage. We don't have an aversion to marriage, particularly, because there have been abuses. There are parents who abuse their children. We don't have an aversion to having children because some parents have been abusive. Of course, it can have any kind of situation where abuse can be involved. The reason unions grew up in America was not to free slaves. The reason unions grew up in America was because there were people who had businesses and they were abusing their employees. So to throw out slavery as a concept simply because there have been abuses, I think, is to miss the point. In any kind of human relationship, there can be abuses. There can also be benefits. For many people, poor people, perhaps people who weren't educated, perhaps people who had no other opportunity, working for a gentle, caring, loving master was the best of all possible worlds. If you had the right master, everything was taken care of. So we have to go back and take a more honest look at slavery and understand that God has, in a sense, legitimized it when it's handled correctly by saying this is the way you're to view your relationship to Jesus Christ, the perfect, all-wise, all-loving, all-compassionate, all-beneficent Lord, and you willing to be his slave because of such unique care provided by him.
The best thing you can do, or any follower of Jesus can do, to convince people that being a slave of Christ is a good thing, is by sharing your testimony with them. Why is it that you are now living a life of complete surrender to Jesus? What brought you to this point? What changed? That would be, in my mind, Exhibit A to help convince people that being a slave of Christ is a good thing.
Have you seen this video of a pastor preaching to his congregation?
I'm sure there's a lot of Africans that were brought over into slavery, which wasn't right, but they got the gospel when they got here. You know, what would be better? For them to have lived their entire life in Africa free, doing their voodoo or whatever, or what happened?
First of all, your gospel is clearly not my gospel. The gospel I know is good news to the oppressed, not a good excuse for oppression. But second, and very important, Christianity already existed in West and Central Africa well before white enslavers stole my ancestors. In fact, historians found a letter written in the year 1619, where a Catholic bishop was outraged that more than 4,000 African Christians had been captured by slave traders in Angola. This means that it is likely that there were Christians among the very first Africans sold on American soil. Thing 3. At some point, Christians have to ask themselves, what is it about their faith that allows it to so easily fit within the framework of white supremacy? So no, we didn't need your bastardized version of Christianity then, and we certainly don't need it now. If you enjoyed content about history and culture, subscribe.
Y'all justifying 400 years of brutal chattel slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, having drugs dumped into our neighborhoods by the Reagan administration, and currently being shot down in the street by police in 2025, all from a curse given from a loving God, or being a chosen one will never sit right with me. Some of y'all are seriously unwell. Let me put something in perspective for you. Jim Crow ended in 1965. My mother was born in 1955, which means Jim Crow ended when she was 10. She was a part of those first group of kids that had to integrate with white people. They were getting bullied in school and chased home. Some of them didn't even make it home. You know what it took for me and you to exist with all the things that our ancestors actually survived? There are entire bloodlines that do not exist today because they did not survive Middle Passage. They did not survive 400 years of brutal chattel slavery. They didn't survive Jim Crow or the civil rights movement. They couldn't even get a drink of water at a colors-only water fountain in peace without being harassed by them. Well, shit, if this what it means to be chosen, then count me out. You mean to tell me a all-knowing, all-seeing, omnipresent, loving God gives a fuck whether or not Black people could have ice cream? Because that was a reality for them. They weren't allowed to have ice cream for the color of their skin. There's nothing in this world that could ever justify that. And it's not lost on me that some African leaders actually had their hand in slavery. Unlike majority of y'all, I actually took African American studies and world religions when I was in college. The part that y'all keep skipping over or just flat out don't know in totality is they were actually lied to. And by the time they figured out what was really popping off over here, it was too late to get them back. And only Haiti came over here to try to save them. Let's clock that T. Y'all like the dog out hate. Civilization existed 12,000 plus years before Christianity. Christianity is only like 2,000 or something years old. Jesus, or Yeshua ben Joseph, because that actually would have been his name, died for our sins. His blood sealed the old covenant, which was the mark of the new covenant, the entire purpose of the whole New Testament. And yet chattel slavery happened thousands of years after that. Thousands of years after that. And y'all are still using this asinine rhetoric to justify us being in the position that we are in. No, the reason why we're in the position that we're in is because you don't want to release yourself from mental slavery.
Welcome back. Now, many white people or many white pastors, many white preachers, even today, they are trying to defend slavery. Why? Because their religion came with a lot of things, okay? All atrocities that happened to black people were backed up by Christianity, or, but they don't want to be held accountable. They don't want their children to ask them questions. And let me say this is not gospel. This is not truth. This is nothing but a racist defense mechanism, okay? And today, I'm going to break down how. Because we have listened to these pastors, and each and every preacher here is trying to defend how American slavery was not so bad, how when you get a good slave master, you live good, how Africans were primitive until colonization came, how slavery helped black people. You see? So, I'll say this. This white preacher stood before people, stood before congregation, stood before people who believe anything he says because they know he's a son of God, or, he is sent by God. And he tried to use this God's name to justify one of the worst crimes ever in human history. He tried to use God's name, and the way he framed it is very important, that God used it. Yes, it is bad, but God used slavery to bring Africans to heaven. So, and even he's asking questions. If slavery was not there, that means black people could have gone to hell, to hellfire. But because slavery came, it helped them to go to heaven. So the part that I did not hear, the part that I wanted to hear the most is that, and how about those oppressors? How about those slave masters? Will they go to heaven or will they go to hell? Because the atrocities they did, it is against the will of God. Now, in fact, during slavery itself, many of the sermons preached in white churches were about this, okay? And these pastors, for example, the first one, I played the video, who was saying that slavery was used to bring black people to the church, to heaven. I think he could work well being a preacher back days. I think he is a descendant of those ancestors, those missionaries, because exactly what he's saying is exactly what pastors taught in school, or was what pastors taught in churches back then to justify their slaveries, okay? Because the preachers will stand before their congregation and read messages like, servant, obey your masters, from the Bible, okay? And they will tell the enslaved Africans that their suffering was ordained by God. Things like this. That they will tell white audience that slavery was not only acceptable, but it was holy. Those are the things they were saying to the church, the congregation. So when this modern pastor says maybe God used slavery for good, he's echoing the same poison that his spiritual ancestors have been preaching for centuries. And let me be clear on this. I'm not that much spiritually, but anytime, what I know is that anytime someone tries to use God to excuse oppression, that's not a gospel. You ain't hearing the gospel. You are hearing white supremacists dressed up as a religion. Point clear. That's not gospel. Now, let's think about what he actually said, because he claimed that if Africans had stayed in Africa, if black Americans had stayed in Africa, they would have been going on with the voodoo. They will have been doing voodoo, and go to hell. That was heavy. That statement, it is dripping with racism. That statement alone, it is soaked in racism, because it erases the fact that Africa is the birthplace of spirituality. Africa is where humanity first lifted its eyes to the heaven. Africa is where some of the world's oldest sacred textbooks and traditions were born, okay? And this happened even before Europe itself existed. Africa already had temples, priests, even before Europe existed. So what is he telling us here? What is he telling us here? This is to say that Africans were just doing voodoo. He's trying to say that. And that is being ignorant. It is intentional, okay? It is designed to paint Africa as godless. It is designed to paint Africa as uncivilized and hopeless without white intervention. And that is exactly what colonial people lied to us. That it was a lie that was used to justify slavery and colonization. The idea that Europe was bringing right to Africa, that was a lie. Now, Africa was the light long before Europe knew what light even was. Africa was building pyramids, okay? While Egypt or while Europe was still living in caves, Africa were building pyramids. Africa had universities, name them like Timbuktu, okay? And Europe was just still struggling with literacy. Africa had moral codes. Africa had system of justice. Africa had deep reverence for the Creator, while Europe was still burning women at the stake. So when a white pastor says slavery was God's way for saving Africans, he's not just wrong. He's deliberately participating in the centuries of all the lies. A lie that says African life had no meaning until it was touched by a white man. A lie that says African spirituality was worthless until replaced by European Christianity. A lie that makes us believe that our chains were actually blessings to us. I want to reflect something here. Imagine the arrogance of saying that God needed white enslavers to beat, to unalive, to rape, black people so that they could meet God. Which kind of God is that? Which? Tell me in the comment section. Personally, I think that is what I call blasphemy. It is complete insult to the Creator himself. And are we really going to believe that the Creator of the universe, who made Africa, made human beings, who blessed Africa with abundance, who gave Africans wisdom, has no way to reach his children except through the suffering? Is it that God cannot reach black people unless we die, unless we were whipped, unless we were chained? No. That's not how it is. What really happened, personally, my thinking, I think white enslavers needed a justification for their crimes. They needed a way to sleep at night while trafficking millions of human beings across the oceans. And so they came up with the Bible. They twisted the Bible. They built a theology that said slavery was not only acceptable, but necessary and tragically. And many of those twisted ideas are still alive until today. They are still being used. And that's why we have to confront these preachers. Why we have to expose this rhetoric every time it surfaces. Because this is not just about history. This is about the present. It's about how black people are still being manipulated, are still being lied today. It's about how young African and young African American children are still taught that their ancestors were godless until the white man came. That belief only corrode the minds of black people. It makes us feel less. It makes us feel inferior. And that's not how we are. We are the great people. Family, I love history. And I'm going to dig back to history a little bit. The long history of white preachers, white pastors defending slavery. Because during the transatlantic slave trade, European nation needed a moral excuse for what they were doing. Okay? They knew it was wrong. They knew it was inhuman what they are doing. But they also knew it was profitable to them. And again, it was erasing black people from the face of the earth because of the benefits they knew themselves. Okay? And whenever money and power are involved, people will always try to find a way to sanitize evil. Okay? Now, for Europe and America, the church became this sanitizer. Pastors preached sermons saying slavery was ordained by God. They pointed to passages in Old Testament about servants. They pointed to the story of Noah, claiming that Africans were cursed through Ham, Noah's son. And that so-called curse of Ham theology became one of the most dangerous lies in the human history. It is said that black people were destined to be slaves. I'm sorry for that. Okay? And white people were destined to be their masters. But who spread this lie? It is white pastors, white preachers, white theologians, white missionaries. Even in America, some of the biggest church denominations were literally built on defending slavery. For example, the Southern Convention, for example, was founded in 1845 by Baptists in the South who believed slavery was not only acceptable but it was biblical. Methodists, and there's one church there, they split between North and South, largely over the issue of slavery. Okay? White Christians were so determined to defend slavery that they divided their churches and created new denominations so that they could keep their slaves. Now, think about something here. This history were not fringe groups, okay? These were not fringe groups. These were the mainstream churches of America. Sunday after Sunday, pulpit rang with sermons telling white Christians that enslaving Africans was their duty and telling Africans that obedience was their path to salvation. And when enslaved Africans began to resist, let me tell you what was done to them. They were doubled down by the white pastors. They wrote pamphlets, books, and theological argument defending slavery. But these things are what the white pastors did, and they said that ending slavery would go against God's order. Said that abolition or abolitionists were enemies of the gospel. Okay? They even went so far to say that freeing black people would lead to chaos because black people are naturally inferior. Now, this is not just history, the mere history. This theology still lives up today. You know what I'm saying, okay? You know why I'm saying that. Because when that modern white pastors say slavery brought Africans to God, he's echoing the same theology in predecessors or by the predecessors preached, okay? He may dress it up differently, but the core is the same. Slavery was bad, but it was necessary, and it was used by God. That's what he's trying to say, and that is against the will of God, okay? And that thing is so much dangerous because it allows white Christians to avoid true repentance. If slavery was used by God, then it wasn't really their fault. Okay? That's what they will think. If Africans benefited by finding Jesus, then maybe it wasn't so evil after all. Okay? So do you see the game here? Do you see the game here? It turns one of the greatest crimes in history into a blessing in disguise. It's called mind game. It's called mind game. But if I may ask, who benefited from slavery? Okay? Was it Africans who were kidnapped, who were unalived, who were chained, who were forced to work until they died? Or was it white plantation owners who built massive wealth off the stolen labor? Was it African families who were torn apart? Or was it white merchants, white bankers, white nations who grew rich from the slave trade? Who benefited? Slavery did not bless Africans. That is the reality. Slavery did not bless black people. Slavery enriched Europe and America. It built Wall Street. It built the banks. It built the universities. And it built the Western world as we know it. And to cover their guilty, they wrapped it into theology and told us it was God's plan. So we need to say this clearly. God that I know, God that I pray, never did that. Never ordained slavery. God never needed slavery to spread his word. And any pastor who says otherwise is not speaking the truth. He is defending the same system his ancestors defended. Okay. Another thing I got from the message, it is the insult to African spirituality. And I always say this. What were Africans worshipping before slavery came? Was it working? Was it not working? Because this, what I see here, is an insult to African spirituality. Because first, he reduces the entire continent of Africa with thousands of ethnic groups, ethnic languages, ethnic spiritual systems, and civilization into one stereotype, voodoo. Is bringing African continent down. He's belittling Africa, and then he dismisses all of it as demonic. So each and every African was using voodoo, and it was demonic. That's what he's trying to say. And this is the same mindset that colonizers had. When they survived, or when they arrived in Africa, they did not take, or they didn't take time to learn our African spiritualities, our spiritual systems. They didn't try to understand the philosophy, the moral codes, or the relationship with the nature and the creator. Okay? They looked at everything African and called it pagan. They looked at everything we are doing and call it heathen and call it savage. And then they declared their mission was to save Africans from themselves. Who does that? Who does that? Because we have the truth. The truth is that Africa has always been deeply spiritual long before Europeans arrived. Africans believe in a supreme creator. Among the Akan people of Ghana, that is the Nyama, the supreme god. We had among the Yoruba, Nigerian, there is a Oladumare. Oladumare wanema. That song you hear. Okay? Now, we have among the Zulu of South Africa, there is a Nkulunkulu. Okay? And these are not small gods. These are the supreme creator, the source of all life. They never complained that their God is not working. Alongside the creator, Africans also recognize spiritual forces, ancestors, and its interconnectedness to life. African spirituality was about harmony, peace, love, okay? With nature, with community, with the unseen world. It was about balance, justice, and respect for creation. Now, trying to compare Christianity and the so-called voodoo, which one is the best? Because Christianity, work was to unalive, was to rape, was to, but voodoo was used in a good purpose. So which one is the best? Okay? Africans were not crossing the ocean to enslave Europeans. Africans were not burning Europeans' village and stealing European children. No. It was Europeans who crossed the ocean with chains, with guns. It was Europeans who unleashed centuries of suffering, who unalived people. The truth is, African spirituality was demonized not because it was evil, but because it gave African dignity, it gave African identity and power. And the colonizer knew that if they could make Africans despise their tradition, they could control them more easily. And that's why they banned shrines. That's why they banned rituals. That's why they forced Christians onto Africans or onto enslaved Africans while refusing to teach them how to read. They wanted Africans to worship their God but not have access to the knowledge. Africa didn't just accept Christianity as it was given. They reshaped it. They infused it with African rhythms, with African songs, with African hope, and that's how modern spirituality of Africans was born. That's how black church became a force of resistance, okay? Enslaved Africans found in the Bible a story of liberation, Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage, and they clung to it. But make no mistake, that was not a slave master gospel. That was reinterpreted. What Africans used was reinterpreted gospel, reimagined, reshaped, Africanized gospel of freedom. Okay? So when a white pastor today says slavery brought Africans to God, we need to correct him. It didn't. African already knew God, already praising God. Okay? So slavery did not bring God. It brought chains. There's a lot I can talk about this. Because this rhetoric is still dangerous. This rhetoric is still dangerous up to today. And we need to know that it has the psychological manipulation to people. We need to know that, okay? Because this idea that black people should be thankful for slavery, thankful for the chains, thankful for the whips, or for the plantation, because it supposedly gave them access to Christianity, to education, to civilization, it is so dangerous. We'll talk about that some other day, okay? Tell me what you think in the comment section. Until next episode, peace out.